Let's listen in.
Director of Public Works. So let me say good morning. Let me thank all of you for being here. The City of Houston main water system is currently, as you know, under a boil water notice with two caveats. This does not apply to Kingwood, and neither does it apply to those who are serviced by the Clear Lake Water Authority. Okay, so Kingwood and those who are serviced by the Clear Lake Water Authority are not impacted by the boil water notice. And let me kind of go over the timeline of events that triggered the boil water notice. At 10:30 a.m. Sunday morning, the East Water Purification Plants 1 and 2 lost power. At 10:50, Plant 3 lost power. And these are the three plants located inside the East Water Purification Plant. Just before 11 a.m., the water pressure dipped below the regulatory levels of 35 psi at 21 water pressure monitoring sites. So they dipped below 35 at 11 a.m. At 11 a.m., pressure at 16 of those 21 sites dropped below the emergency regulatory level of 20 psi. So that was at 11 a.m. 16 of the 21 sites dropped below the emergency regulatory level of 20 psi. Pressure rebounded above 20 psi in less than 2 minutes at 14 of the 16 locations. So I want us to kind of make sure we understand the timeline and what was happening here. So at 14 of those 16, where it fell below 20 psi, they remained below 20 psi for less than 2 minutes. The remaining 2 locations of that 16 rose above the 20 psi at 11:30. So 14 were below 20 psi for less than 2 minutes. 2 of the sensors rebounded above the 20 psi in 30 minutes. For 5 of the 21 sensors, they never fell below 20 psi. Okay. A plant electrician arrived at the East Water Purification Plant at 11 a.m. to troubleshoot the problem. Further investigation by the Houston Water found that 2 transformers at Plant 1 went offline due to a ground trip and current overload. The electrical feeder from Plant 3 also experienced a ground fault trip. Both Sabre, that's S-A-B-E-R, B as in boy, E-R, the electrical contractor, and CenterPoint Energy were on site to investigate how not one transformer faulted, but the redundant transformer also failed. And what I'm being told, even when you have the grid providing power and you have your generators to step in, when these 2 transformers failed, it prevented the power to the system. Power was restored to plants 1 and 2 at 12:15 p.m. Sunday.
I'm sorry, p.m. Yes.
At 12:15 p.m. on Sunday, and power was restored to Plant 3 at 12:30. So in terms of the power disruption, 2 hours, from 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. 21 sensors, 16 of them fell below 20 psi. 14 of the 16 stayed below for less than 2 minutes, and 2 stayed below for 30 minutes. Power was restored at 12:30 p.m. Full water pressure was restored to all 3 plants by 3:30 p.m., and all locations were back at 35 psi's. Further investigation and testing on the breakers, transformers, motors, and feeders found a bad cell in Plant 1 transformer. And I have asked for a complete diagnostic review of this system to further verify and to identify how we make sure it does not happen again. The Houston Water field staff verified all pressures across the system. Houston Water, in communication with TCEQ, determined a boil water notice needed to be issued on Sunday evening and that was somewhere around 6 p.m., 6:40 is when that decision was made. Conversations with TCEQ were taking place from 2:43 p.m. up to 6:40. And it was at that point, based on the data, based on the sensors, that it was a decision was made that a boil water notice was to be issued. And one of the reasons why it took that long, because as you can see, for 14 of the sensors, they remain below 20 psi for less than 2 minutes. And for 2 sensors, they remain below 20 psi for 30. So there were questions as to whether or not even a boil water notice needed to be issued. A decision was made out of abundance of caution to issue the boil water notice, and it was done. Notice was sent to the public at 6:44 p.m. Sunday night. And here's where we stand right now. The TCEQ approved our water sampling plan at 10:41 p.m. Sunday night. And I want to thank TDM, Texas Department of Emergency Management, and TCEQ for working with the Houston Public Works Department. They approved the water sampling plan at 10:41 p.m. Sunday night. Samples were pulled from 29 locations at 6 a.m. and 9:30 this morning. 2 locations, and out of, again, abundance of caution, just in case if the first sample didn't pan out, then we had another sample ready to go. All the samples arrived at Houston Water Labs by 9:45 this morning. The samples will then sit and incubate for at least 18 hours per state regulations, and the first reads of the samples will be taken at 3, that should be 3 p.m.
Well, we'll review it, but the first official read that we can do is at 3 a.m.
At 3 a.m. to determine if the water is free from contamination. Those results will be sent to the TCEQ for verification and to determine if the city can rescind the boil water notice. Although there'll be various readings throughout the day that will give us some indication as to whether or not we anticipate the end result to be a very positive one. We are optimistic the results will come back clean. The TCEQ will notify the city once we can rescind the boil water notice, and it's our hope that we can get a positive word at least late tonight or early on tomorrow morning, because we would love to see schools resume, businesses continue to function and open up if they have had to close, and if there are any surgeries that are having to be postponed, hopefully they can proceed on tomorrow. So that's where we are, okay? And I will take at this point any questions that you may have. One at a time.
Mr. Mayor, people who live in, say, West Houston, in the 4th largest city, wonder, a plant goes down on the east side, why do I have to abide by this notice? Can someone explain the logistics of the water system here? The East Water Purification Plant provides water to pretty much the city as a whole, with the exception of Kingwood and those who receive service from the Clear Lake Water Authority. They have their own sort of systems. But the East Water Purification provides water to the entire city, in addition to some muds that are adjacent, they're very much adjacent. And that's the reason. And even though we don't have any evidence of contamination, and even though the PSI fell below, let's say for 14 of them less than 2 minutes, and for 2 of them about 30 minutes, out of abundance of caution, that's why the notice was given to everybody. Yes.
You said you possibly want to make a decision on the boil water notice late tonight. Can you make that decision before the 3 a.m. read of the samples?
Only we're working in collaboration with TCEQ. They know that the samples have been collected. They're in the incubation stage right now. During the course of the day, we'll take a look to see whether or not there's any contamination of any kind. We'll continue to work very closely with the TCEQ. In the end, it will be their call. So at the latest, we anticipate clean report coming, let's say 3 a.m. at the latest. Could it be before? Possibly, depending on how TCEQ read the data. Okay? Yes, sir.
Can you elaborate on why redundancies did not take over when a transformer failed?
Two transformers
When
failed.
two transformers
They
failed,
can-
or
they-
is there a need for an additional redundancy that does not exist in the system?
The first transformer fell, and then the redundant one was the second transformer, which coincidentally and uniquely also fell. So there were two transformers. One was the backup to the first. They both fell. And then you do have backup generation, but when you have the two, and Carol, you tell me if I'm misstating anything. When you have the two transformers that fail, one was the backup, and you can't connect to the grid where the power is running, and you can't connect to your generators, then you have a very unique and unfortunate situation. Now, I have instructed Public Works to do an overall review of our system, a diagnostic review, to see how we prevent this from happening again. I will tell you we had a similar problem last year, I believe, at the HEC Center, where on a nice day, the power also failed. So that occurred before. This is not the first. It's the first in this particular situation, but the backup was the second transformer for the system. For whatever reason, and I'm not the technical person, I can't tell you why both failed. But, I will say stuff does happen. It's unfortunate. A lot of people were impacted and are impacted. Certainly apologize for that. But we'll do a diagnostic review and work with all of our partners to assess the situation and to mitigate a future occurrence of this kind. Yes.
People all around Houston are obviously very angry today. And one of the questions they are asking is, I know y'all were making a decision during that time in between the outage, during the time between there and the notification, but why couldn't Houstonians have been given any information during that time just so that they could make their own educated decisions?
Well, but that's why we have the process in place. This is a situation in which you had 21 sensors that indicated after there was a power disruption between 10:30 and 12:30, but starting at 11 o'clock, 21 sensors indicated that the power would drop below 35 psi. That doesn't trigger a boil water notice. Okay, that doesn't trigger a boil water notice. And the PSIs didn't just drop automatically when the power was disrupted. It was during the course of the day. So when 21 of the sensors dropped below 35, that didn't trigger boil water notice. When 16 of those 20 dropped below 20 PSIs, okay, and 14 of them dropped below PSI for less than 2 minutes, okay, then still, there was not the thinking that was going to trigger. And 2 of them dropped below PSIs for 30 minutes. So less than 2 minutes for most of them, 14, 30 minutes for 2. And so the thinking was it was not going to trigger a need for a boil water notice, and there was no alarm. And even now, we can't, my notion is that the water is safe, but between 2:43 p.m. up to 6:40 p.m., the team, Houston team, was in collaboration with TCEQ. Everybody's looking at the data. Everybody's looking at the data. A decision was then made out of an abundance of caution, okay, to then issue the boil water notice. And under the normal processes, you have a city, municipality, has 24 hours to issue the boil water notice from the time of the incident. You have 24 hours. So I can understand people being angry, but what I can say to people is that this was a situation that was not being overlooked, ignored. Teams were in, our electrician was in, and as you can see, the power was restored at 12:30 p.m. CenterPoint was looking at it. We were in collaboration with TCEQ, and a decision was made out of an abundance of caution to issue the boil water notice. Okay, I will tell you, having experience in going through Harvey, when our Northeast Water Purification Plant was totally underwater, In that particular case, we came close to 20 PSIs, but we never issued a ball water notice. We never did. Okay? I can understand people's concern when we finally did it, but do understand we had 24 hours. In this case, in our collaboration, everybody looking at the data, looking at the sensors and what the read was, a decision was made out of an abundance of caution to issue the ball water notice, and that is what we did. Yes.
It's also very important.
Come.
It's also very important to note that we had no indication that the system had been infiltrated, unlike when we had the 96-inch line break where we knew that the system had been exposed, that the potential for contamination to get in. In this particular case, the system had not had any indication that we had had the potential for contamination to get in while we went through this, which was why we went through the process of calibrating the pressure reads and working with TCEQ over the course of the afternoon. And it really was at the end of the day that we said, out of an abundance of caution and, the fact that we did dip below, that we said, out of an abundance of caution and, the fact that we did dip below that 20 PSI that the issuance needed to happen. But we had no indication, we still have no indication that the system was compromised at any point. And that it had any of the type of catastrophic potential that a larger event might have had and caused an immediate notice, which is what you got when we had the Clinton Drive failure that happened. So in this case, it was the process working through, and we still do not have any indication that we had any intrusion or anything that got into the system at all. But we are following through the process to make sure that we ensure for everybody that the water is safe.
What time, can you just reiterate, sorry, what time did it drop below the regulatory levels, the 20?
Go on, yeah.
Sure. So the first sensors alarmed at 10:58 that we were below 35. The second sensors alarmed, 16 sensors alarmed at 11 a.m. that it was below 21. At 11:02, 14 sensors were back above 20. At 11:30, the 2 remaining sensors were back above 20.
So before 11 o'clock, they were below the regulatory levels, right?
It wasn't until 11 a.m. They were below 35, but still above the emergency regulatory levels at 10:58. At 11 a.m., 16 sensors dipped below the emergency regulatory level.
So even though you guys didn't realize at the time this would trigger a boil water notice, don't you still think it's important that the water pressure still went below the regulatory levels around 11 a.m.? And again, we didn't find out until, I know you guys have 24 hours, but.
Bear in mind, the conversations with TCQ was at 2:43, started at 2:43. No one said a ball water notice had to be issued. You had 14 sensors that were below 20 PSI for less than 2 minutes, okay? There was no indication, as Director Haddock has indicated, that there was any intrusion in the system. There was no indication. And you had 2 sensors, too, that stayed below 20 PSIs for 30 minutes. And the power was restored to the entire system at 12:30. So there was no indication there was any intrusion. And you had a dippage that was significant within a short period of time in comparison to when the 96? When the 96 rupture took place and the power dropped, it stayed below. And I experienced that as well, okay? It stayed below. This did not compare at all to what took place then when the 96-inch power.
What about last year, the February freeze? You mentioned we're going to review what actions need to be taken. Can you talk already about what specifically?
Well, the February freeze is a totally sort of different matter. You lost power and water, and things remained down for several days, okay? For several days. We are talking about 14 of your sensors falling below 20 PSIs for less than 2 minutes. So let's not necessarily compare February Windstorm Uri with this situation. We do have 2 transformers that malfunction, and so we do need to do a diagnostic test analysis on why that occurred and how we can prevent that from happening again.
Can you talk quickly about the infrastructure at that plant? I saw some pictures where you see molded and rusted equipment. Can you dive into the last time you toured the facility and how they're keeping up to date with
We
their
provide
equipment?
regular maintenance to all of those facilities. In this case, there were 2 transformers. I know people are looking for some other things out there. There were 2 transformers that fell. Would we prefer that not to occur? No. Okay. But the team was on it. They reviewed it. The electrician was out there within 30 minutes. Within 30 minutes, they were out there. And then CenterPoint was also out there. Now, do you want to give a boil water notice to a city of 2 million plus people? No. It affects schools and businesses and surgeries? No. But at the same time, after looking at the data, working in collaboration with TCEQ and the partners, out of an abundance of caution, the decision was made to do it.
Mayor, on
Yes.
the backup generators, you mentioned them earlier.
Yes.
Energy tells us there were 32 of them at the Federal Road plant. They were available and ready, but were not turned on. Just to clarify, did the city ever request from Energy that Energy turn those on, and if not, why not?
And again, I'm going to let Carol explain it because as it has explained to me.
So no, so we did not request the backup generators be turned on because our actual primary feed through the grid was actually still up and providing electricity. The failure was inside the plant that was between the supply side and getting to our treatment facility. And so even if the backup generators had been on, we would have had the same problem. And so the primary focus in that 2-hour window was getting those transformers reset, getting that backup and getting the power through it. So we did not call for the backup generators, but they would not have made a difference since that was not, the supply of power was not the issue.
And a brief follow-up to a question over there earlier. You mentioned the sensors. Where were they located? Were they spread throughout the city, or were they just at that one plant?
So we have sensors throughout the city. The 21 that alarmed are primarily kind of, the plant is located near the intersection of Clinton and Federal Road, so on the east side. The majority of the sensors were kind of in a swath that went basically from there just inside 610 kind of down, and then there were a couple that continued on a little bit in the northwest area.
And let me just say, because the second transformer was the backup to the first, and it also failed, that's why I've ordered a diagnostic review and bringing in an outside team to look and see, to assess what took place there and how that can be mitigated in the future. But the second transformer was the backup to the first. Okay, any other? Final questions, one here and one here. Yes, sir. Yes,
First
sir.
of all, I just want to be clear, what specifically did the power outage affect? Was it the treatment process, or was it the ability to pump the finished water out to the system?
So it was both. So when it affected the entire plant, it affected the treatment plants from treating water, but it also impacted the ability for us to pump water through the pumps that actually push it into the transmission system. That was actually what caused the pressure loss. We had enough water in the ground storage tanks. It was the pushing the water into the system that resulted in the pressure loss.
Can you also explain again about the generators? Because there's a lot of people that were asking that, why wasn't there something that just instantly prevented that power disruption? I understand you have to call for the backup generators to come out, but is there nothing on site, given that PSI is such a critical component of water treatment, is there anything on site that could have prevented that interruption in power at all?
So that is actually one of the questions that we will be working with the forensics to ask that specific question. We had, state of, practice redundancy built into our system, but we're gonna push ourselves to go beyond that and ask those questions. The feed fed the entire plant and those pumps. Do they need to be evaluated different? That's going to be some of the questions that we ask through this after action review.
And let me just say to you, that was the question that I asked. Okay, because we are designing a resilient, sustainable system. So when I got the call on yesterday, and they told me there was a power disruption, the question that I immediately asked, did the generators kick on? And I was told, no, Mayor, the generators didn't kick on, and I asked why. Okay, why did they not kick on? Okay, and then through a lot of conversations were taking place, and they got back and said transformers malfunction. And I asked, why? Okay? And so what we are going to do, and what I've instructed Houston Public Works, is to do a diagnostic review to explain to me exactly, what took place and how we can prevent it from taking place again, or at least to mitigate, okay? But the second transformer was intended to back up the first. And then if you have the generators in place when the grid power goes out, and then if the transformers are in between, then I'm still not a happy trooper. So those are the questions that I've asked, and what I would say to the people in the city of Houston, we'll work through the system, we'll do a diagnostic review, and so we'll address that situation. Okay, any other questions on this subject?
Does the city plan to distribute any water today, and if not, why not?
If there are certain areas, for example, or facilities that need water, we will certainly do our best to make them available. But from all indications, this is not like Winter Storm Uri when you lost power and water. You can borrow your water and then move forward. Some of the businesses are doing it. For example, there's no disruptions, for example, at the airports. They're moving forward.
And when it's lifted, is it going to be piecemeal or it's going to be lifted citywide?
The
Entire city.
The entire city. You're talking about if the water notice is suspended, it'll be for the entire city. And again, Kingwood and those serviced by Clear Lake Water Authority are not impacted. Yes. Yeah, I mean, if, for example, with the mayor's office, people with disabilities, if there are people who are needing it, we certainly will be doing our best to provide water for them. And then we've had some other companies to reach out and say if we need their assistance, they're prepared to do that. Okay.
I just have a quick clarification question.
Sure.
Does TCEQ have to order the boil water notice?
Yes, they're the ones.
The city, does this?
So the city of Houston issues the boil water notice, but we do that in consultation, and basically we get concurrence from TCEQ that based on the data they reviewed, that they concur that we need to issue a boil water notice, and then as the owner of the utility, we actually issue it, and that's why we issued it at 6:47.
But you have to do it with TCEQ's permission, basically?
So, yes, we worked with them on the data that we had. They reviewed the data. There were questions throughout the course of the day whether or not that we had actually tripped enough triggers to require it because they rebounded so quickly. But we worked with them on the data. We did the back calibration, and they confirmed that reviewing the data, they agreed and instructed us to move forward with the boil water notice.
And then just a clarification on what's the potential that can happen when the PSI falls that low?
So when the PSI gets below 20, and the state can certainly, because this is a statewide requirement, but that is the potential that you could actually have contaminants introduced into the system. And that's why they require that boil water notice if it goes below 20 PSI for an extended period of time. It is not one of the primary listed. If you go out to the state code and look at the 5 conditions, you have filters, or you have too high a turbidity coming out of the plant, or you have known contaminants. We didn't trip any of those because we didn't have any of those conditions. This is one that is a consult with TCEQ on the data that you have available. The professionals on both sides reviewed the data, reviewed the information, and said that we felt like we needed to, out of an abundance of caution, make sure that we got through this. Again, we did not have any indication yesterday, today, of any intrusion in the system at all.
Any plans to add text messaging to the advisories for the city and not just email? Some people were saying they did not get that email message for hours.
We did send it out, Alert Houston.
I know I talked to Chief Bunick with the Director of Homeland Security, and on the emergency provision, instructed him to send out text messages. Okay.
We know, though, a lot of people didn't get those messages until about 10:30. That's the time we got from a lot of our viewers. So we just didn't know, were there any plans to make that earlier if the decision was made at about 6:40?
Let me just say, I know we relied heavily on getting the social media aspects, sending out the emails, and then I know I talked to Chief Bunick myself and instructed that the text messages go out.
So any way to improve that? We know there are a lot of people who aren't signed up for these messages and things
Right.
like that. And of course, it's important information.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, I would say for everybody, it is important to register with Alert Houston. It is one of the primary channels during emergencies that we transmit information. And it is certainly, we've already got it on our list on the after-action review of making sure that notification happens earlier. In the past, we were in weather emergencies, so we were already in those communication channels. In this case, it was not a weather emergency. So we're absolutely going to review our processes on that and evaluate the revisions to that process to see if that happens simultaneously.
So when did y'all notify the other municipalities?
So the
Did all of that happen at the same time?
So the phone calls, we had the team that manages our contracts started making phone calls right after 6:40 when we had the phone calls, emails, texts to all of our contract customer contacts that we have available to us. Those calls had all been completed before 8 to notify all those adjacent that take water from our main water system.
And are you looking at ways to send those text alerts and those emails to everybody within a geographic area? Is there a way to do that now, or if not, is that something you're looking at doing? Because we have heard from a lot of people that did not get the text, did not get the email.
I know Chief Bunick, but the Department of Homeland Security is taking a look at all of that. And so we'll see how we can certainly improve it and make sure that it's much more ubiquitous. So we'll take a look at that.
What about the emergency alert system, given this was a civil emergency?
I thought I issued that, but did it not go out?
That is definitely something that we will check with the team internally and find out what the processes were. It didn't trigger over to that this time, and I will ask for us to review as part of what the mayor's asked us to review those processes to see if that should have.
But, Mr. Mayor, you did ask for a triggering of the EAS?
I wanted the notices to go out.
Of the Alert Houston.
Of the Alert Houston, yes, sir. Okay. Okay. So Ben, this is the third waterborne notice as far as that I can recall. One dealt with the 96-inch pipeline breakage, and in that situation, your PSI level was down for quite some time. Okay. Didn't even come close to this. It was down for quite some time. The second was Winter Storm Uri, and we were without power and pressure for several days. In this particular situation, as we have already described, you've heard several times when the PSI levels dropped below 20 and how long that was. So again, out of abundance of caution, in collaboration with TCEQ, the boil water notice was issued, and then we'll do a diagnostic review to see how we can mitigate this situation from happening again. Certainly want to say to people in the city of Houston, certainly apologize for the disruptions, kids having to miss school, businesses impacted, even some elective surgeries having to be postponed. But our hope is by late tonight or early tomorrow morning, we'll get a positive response from TCEQ and that the boil water notice can be lifted. That's where we are. Let me thank you all, and I hope we've answered whatever questions that you may have.
Mayor, the first event you mentioned, was that the entire city, or is this the first time the entire city said?
That was the east.
The 96-inch was the entire,
That was
the entire main system. Uri was the main system as well as some of our isolated.
Yeah. And with the 96-inch, that did not include Kingwood and the Clear Lake, but it was the entire system. Okay. All right. So if
We're going to have a very important announcement about the city-county interlocal agreement in Chapter 25 proposed changes. If you need to transition out, we'll bring it on to people for that discussion right now. So just about 1 minute.
We've been listening to the mayor telling us that the boil water notice for Houston remains in effect. He's hoping it could be lifted later today or early tomorrow.
Yeah, all of this caused by a brief power failure at 3 water plants Sunday morning. The mayor saying that boil water notice was issued out of an abundance of caution, but of course caused a lot of concern and problems for folks around town. Stephanie Whitfield live in the newsroom with more. Steph.
Yes, Mayor Sylvester Turner has been recapping exactly what went wrong yesterday and what has to happen in order to lift the boil water notice. So here's what we know about yesterday at this point. Yesterday morning, power went out at several different treatment plants. Power went out at the water treatment plant, impacting several different Sorry, I'm going to start over right now. So what we know at this point is yesterday power went out at the water treatment plant, and that triggered the water pressure to drop at several different locations. That happened, the power was out for about 2 hours, but water pressure dropped at most of those sensor locations for about 2 minutes. 2 of them, the pressure was low for 30 minutes. And because of that, that triggered conversations with TCEQ in the city of Houston to decide whether or not they wanted to issue the boil water notice. That did happen last night at around 6:45. Now, what has to happen for everything to go back to normal and for the boil water notice to be lifted? Several things have to happen. So first of all, the city of Houston had to submit a plan to TCEQ. That happened last night. TCEQ approved. So now water samples had to be taken at 30 different locations across the city. That happened this morning twice. Now, so those water samples were sent to a lab and the waiting game begins. For 18 hours, those water samples have to sit in the lab to see if any bacteria grows and if those samples have been contaminated. And the earliest that those samples can be tested is at 3 o'clock tomorrow morning. So that's what we're waiting on at this point. Once the results come in, the TCEQ and City of Houston can decide whether or not to lift the boil water notice. And in the meantime, the city is trying to figure out exactly what went wrong with the power outage and generators failing, and hopefully prevent this from happening again. Ron and Reka, I'm going to send it back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We'll, of course, stay on top of this story, bringing the very latest on KHOU 11 News at noon.
And you can get updates anytime on our KHOU 11 app and, of course, on KHOU.com. We'll see you for KHOU 11 News at noon.
Lowers A1C. It goes beyond to reduce the risk of cardiovascular death for adults with type 2 diabetes and known heart disease. And Jardiance